Rain lashed against the windshield as I pulled into the silent driveway. My hands were cramped from the 6-hour drive through the storm. When I got back from the trip, my husband and mother-in-law had left a note. Deal with this senile old woman. I found his grandmother dying in the back room. Suddenly she whispered, "Help me get revenge. They have no idea who I really am." Her fingers clamped onto my wrist with the strength of a drowning sailor. The air in the bedroom tasted like copper and stagnant dust. Margaret lay on a thin mattress that smelled of neglect. A single salt shaker held down the cruel note on the kitchen table. Daniel always hated the way she hummed when he was trying to think. Now the silence was much worse than her humming. I grabbed a glass of water and a silver spoon from the drawer. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Her eyes were fixed on the ceiling. I dribbled water onto her cracked lips until she coughed. Her chest heaved under the threadbare blanket. This woman was the cornerstone of the Morgan family fortune. Yet they left her in the dark without a single lamp burning. I felt a surge of cold fury as I wiped her brow. She looked at me with a sudden, terrifying clarity. There was no dementia in those gray eyes tonight. She struggled to sit up against the pillows. Her voice was a low, rasping vibration. Margaret pointed a trembling finger toward the heavy oak dresser. I pushed the furniture aside until the floorboards groaned. Beneath the wood sat a polished box and a digital keypad. My fingers shook as I entered the code she whispered. A segment of the wall slid back with a mechanical hiss. Blue light flooded the room from a dozen hidden monitors. I saw every corner of the house in high definition. My own bedroom was being searched on screen 3. Daniel was currently there. He was tossing my jewelry into a suitcase with a grin. His mistress laughed as she tried on my grandmother's pearls. They thought I was still 3 states away at the conference. Margaret watched the screen with a face made of stone. She reached for a hidden phone and dialed a number. Her posture shifted until she looked like a queen again. The frail fuckhead was gone in a single heartbeat. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a predator waiting for its prey. The legal team would be here before the sun touched the horizon. I stood beside her and watched my husband's betrayal in vivid color. He had no clue that the house belonged to a trust. I was the secret executor of that entire estate. We sat in the blue glow and planned their total destruction. My phone buzzed with a lying text from Daniel. He asked if I was having a safe trip. I smiled and began to type a very different reply. The game was finally over. I moved toward the kitchen to fetch Margaret more water. My boots clicked on the hardwood like a ticking clock. The house felt like a tomb designed by my husband. I found a hidden vial of clear liquid under the sink. It was tucked behind the bleach and old sponges. Daniel had been adding this to her tea every single morning. I smelled the bitter almond scent of the slow-acting toxin. My hands shook as I poured it down the drain. The grandfather clock chimed 3 times in the foyer. Margaret gestured for me to sit back down beside her. She pulled a heavy brass key from a velvet pouch. It was warm from being hidden against her fragile skin. This key opened the safe in Daniel's private study. I knew he kept his ledger of debts in that room. He thought I was too stupid to understand his business. Margaret looked at me with a cold and knowing smirk. I crept down the hallway toward the locked office door. The shadows seemed to reach for my ankles like ghosts. The key turned in the lock with a satisfying snap. I found the ledger tucked inside a hollowed-out book. It detailed every cent Daniel had stolen from our joint account. He was gambling away my hard-earned salary on bad stocks. He owed a dangerous man over $500,000. This was why he needed Margaret to die. Suddenly the front door creaked open at the end of the hall. I froze behind the heavy mahogany desk and held my breath. Linda's shrill voice echoed through the dark living room. She was complaining about the rain and her ruined shoes. Daniel grunted a reply that sounded like a low growl. They were back much earlier than I had ever expected. I gripped the ledger against my chest like a shield. I was trapped inside his secret office. I heard their footsteps approaching the door of the study. Daniel tried the handle, but found the lock was engaged. He swore loudly and rattled the brass knob with force. I slipped behind the heavy floor, to ceiling velvet curtains. My heart was a frantic drum against my aching ribs. He pulled out his own set of keys to enter. I realized I had left my damp boots by the desk. The door swung open and light hit the floor. Daniel walked to the desk and noticed the empty space. He saw the hollowed-out book lying open on the rug. His face turned a deep and angry shade of crimson. He didn't see me crouching behind the thick green fabric. Linda stood in the doorway and asked about the missing ledger. She looked nervous as she gripped her designer handbag. They both knew their freedom depended on those secret pages. Daniel started to search the room with a frantic energy. I lunged out from behind the curtain and bolted past him. He grabbed for my jacket but missed by an inch. I sprinted toward the back room where Margaret was waiting. Linda screamed for him to stop me before I left. I reached the bedroom and slammed the heavy bolt shut. Margaret was standing by the window with a loaded pistol. She handed me a second key and pointed at the floor. The police sirens were finally wailing in the distance. Daniel threw his entire weight against the bedroom door. The wood groaned, but the heavy iron bolt held fast. Margaret did not flinch at the violent thuds vibrating the walls. She handed me a burner phone with a steady hand. My objective was clear. I had to transmit the ledger files. The signal in this back room was weak and flickering. I held the device near the window to catch a bar. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault. The pounding stopped and was replaced by a chilling silence. I heard Daniel whispering to Linda in the hallway. He was fetching the heavy axe from the garage. Pressure mounted as the file upload bar crawled forward. It was only at 20% when the first blow landed. The blade bit deep into the mahogany door frame. Splinters flew across the room like tiny wooden daggers. Margaret watched the door with a strange, predatory smile. She knew something I did not. I scrambled back as the axe blade reappeared. Daniel's face was a mask of sweating, desperate rage. He screamed at me to hand over the ledger. I ignored him and focused on the glowing screen. 40%. The file was too large for this slow connection. Linda was crying out in the hall about the police. She sounded terrified of the flashing lights in the distance. Daniel didn't care about the sirens anymore. He only wanted the evidence in my hands. Suddenly, the monitor on the wall flickered to life. It showed the driveway through a new thermal lens. 3 black SUVs were skidding onto the wet gravel. These were not the local police cars I expected. These men carried tactical gear and professional-grade rifles. They moved with a synchronized grace toward the front entrance. I looked at Margaret in the dim blue light. She had called her private security firm, not the cops. The power balance shifted in an instant. Daniel managed to kick a hole through the lower panel. He reached through the jagged gap to slide the bolt. I slammed the heavy ledger down onto his prying hand. He howled in pain and retracted his bloody fingers. The file upload finally hit 80% on the screen. I could hear the front door being breached downstairs. A flash. Bang grenade detonated with a muffled roar in the foyer. The entire house seemed to shudder from the impact. I grabbed Margaret's arm to pull her toward the corner. She refused to move and pointed at the monitor. The lead security officer was someone I recognized. It was Gregory, the man Daniel called his best friend. Gregory was leading the team to secure the room. He wasn't there to help my husband escape justice. He was Margaret's primary agent for the last 10 years. Daniel had been betrayed by the only person he trusted. The betrayal was absolute and crushing. The upload finished with a soft, electronic chime. I had sent the proof to every major news outlet. The bedroom door finally shattered under Daniel's frantic boots. He stumbled inside, bleeding and gasping for air. He saw Gregory standing in the doorway behind him. The security team raised their weapons in perfect unison. Daniel looked at me, then at the smiling grandmother. He realized the dying woman was the one holding the gun. There was a third person in the hall. The third person in the hall was Olivia. She stood trembling between two guards in tactical gear. Her face was smudged with running mascara and fear. Daniel tried to reach for her, but Gregory intervened. The barrel of a rifle pressed against his chest. I watched the man I once loved collapse. He looked small and pathetic in the dim light. The authority in the room had shifted entirely. Margaret stood up and straightened her silk nightgown. She was no longer a victim. I felt the adrenaline begin to fade away. My objective now was to secure the box. The wooden box held more than just medicine. It contained the original deeds to the city. Daniel had spent years looking for those papers. I stepped over the debris of the broken door. The smell of gun oil filled the small space. Margaret watched me with a sharp and calculating gaze. She was testing my loyalty one final time. I did not blink. Linda began to wail from the living room floor. Her cries were high and thin like a siren. She was begging for mercy from the armed men. Daniel looked at me with a desperate, pleading expression. He tried to claim he was protecting us both. I didn't say a word as I walked past. The subtext of his lies was finally clear now. He only ever cared about the money and power. I felt a cold knot of indifference. I reached for the polished box under the bed. My fingers brushed the smooth grain of the wood. This was the leverage Margaret needed for the trial. Suddenly, the house lights flickered and died once more. A backup generator kicked in with a low thrum. The thermal monitors on the wall turned bright green. I saw a figure moving toward the back exit. It was not a guard or an intruder. It was the family lawyer, Mr. Thorne. Thorne carried a briefcase that looked heavy and full. He was trying to slip away during the chaos. Gregory signaled his men to cut off the escape. I realized Thorne had been Daniel's silent partner here. He had drafted the fake documents for the theft. The power balance tilted back toward the law now. Margaret nodded at me to stop him at once. I ran down the stairs with the ledger. I felt the weight of justice. The hallway was a maze of shadows and dust. I tackled Thorne just as he reached the door. We hit the floor with a dull, heavy thud. The briefcase burst open, spilling stacks of cash everywhere. He hissed a curse and tried to scramble away. I pinned his arm behind his back with force. Gregory arrived a second later to assist with cuffs. The lawyer's face was pressed into the expensive rug. He had nowhere left to run. We gathered everyone in the center of the room. The rain finally stopped its drumming on the roof. I stood next to Margaret as the sun rose. Daniel was sobbing quietly into his handcuffed hands. Linda refused to look at the woman she abused. Olivia had already started telling the guards everything she knew. The victory felt hollow until I looked at Margaret. She handed me a gold pen and a new contract. My name was already on the first page. I stared at the gold pen in my hand. Margaret's signature was already dry on the vellum. My objective was to secure my own legal immunity now. Without it, I was just a witness to a murder. Daniel watched me from the floor with hollow eyes. He looked like a stranger I had never met before. The power shifted as I pressed the pen down. I signed my name with a steady and firm stroke. My future was finally decoupled from his. Gregory stepped forward and began collecting the spilled cash. He didn't look at Daniel as he worked quickly. The stack of bills felt like dirty laundry now. Linda was still crying about her social standing. She didn't understand that the world was moving on. The reality of prison began to settle on her face. It was a mask of gray skin and sweat. I felt no pity for her or her son. They had made their choices in the dark. The front door opened and more men entered the house. These were not security guards, but federal investigators. They carried evidence bags and cameras for the crime scene. One man walked directly toward me with a badge. He asked for the ledger I was still holding. I handed it over without a moment of hesitation. This was the final nail for Daniel's secret empire. The pressure in the room was thick and very heavy. Everyone waited for the next move. Daniel suddenly lunged toward the investigator with a roar. He was tackled by 2 guards before he moved. His desperation was a physical thing in the air. He shouted that I had set him up tonight. I just watched him with a look of boredom. He had no more cards left to play here. The investigator opened the ledger to the 3rd page. His eyes widened at the names listed in the columns. Daniel had been bribing the local city council. Margaret sat back and sipped a fresh cup of tea. She looked entirely comfortable in the middle of chaos. I realized she had known about the council too. She had been waiting for the feds to arrive. The power balance was now global in its scope. Daniel was not just a thief, he was a traitor. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I had shared a bed with a monster for years. He had used me as a cover. We moved toward the kitchen to give a statement. The investigator asked me how long I had known. I told him the truth about the hidden note. He recorded my words on a small black device. Linda tried to interrupt but was told to shut up. She was being escorted out to a waiting car. I saw the neighbors watching through their windows nearby. The scandal would be in the papers by noon tomorrow. I didn't care about the gossip anymore. The kitchen was cold despite the rising morning sun. I looked at the salt shaker on the table. It was the same one that held the note. I picked it up and felt its familiar weight. Underneath it was a second piece of white paper. It was not in Daniel's messy handwriting at all. This note was written in Margaret's sharp script. It was dated from 3 weeks ago, before my trip. I realized she had planned my return perfectly. She had used me. I stared at the note hidden beneath the salt shaker. Margaret had anticipated every move of the last hour. She knew exactly when I would pull into the drive. My objective now was to confront her about this manipulation. The air in the kitchen felt colder than the rain. Daniel was being dragged away by the federal agents outside. His screams were muffled by the heavy front door. I looked at the old woman sitting at my table. She was sipping tea with a terrifying calm. The investigators began to pack their black bags with evidence. They ignored the tension rising between the two of us. I held up the secret note for Margaret to see. Her expression did not change as she watched me. She had used my grief as a catalyst for her plan. I was just another piece on her grand chessboard. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I felt my skin go cold with a new kind of fear. She was not our savior. Margaret finally set her teacup down on the wooden surface. She looked at the note and gave a small nod. "I needed to know you were capable of this," she said. Her voice was no longer rasping or weak at all. It was the sharp tone of a corporate shark. She had staged her own neglect to flush them out. I was the witness she required for the final kill. The power in the room shifted toward her completely. I felt like a small, trapped animal. The federal agent returned and asked for my final signature. I hesitated as I looked at the legal documents again. These papers did more than just grant me immunity tonight. They transferred Daniel's remaining assets into a new trust fund. Margaret was the sole beneficiary of every single penny earned. I was signing away the money I had worked for. My overtime and bonuses were all flowing into her hands. She had reclaimed everything, including my own sweat and blood. It was a masterstroke. Daniel's mistress, Olivia, was led past the kitchen window now. She looked at me with a gaze full of pity. I realized she wasn't just a mistress to my husband. She had been working for Margaret the entire time too. She was the one who planted the slow, acting toxins. The balance of power was a complex web of lies. I was the only person who had been truly blind. My husband was a fool, but I was a tool. The betrayal felt absolute. I turned to Margaret and asked why she chose me. She smiled and smoothed her perfectly styled silver hair. "You have a clean record and a heavy heart," she replied. She needed someone the jury would believe without any doubt. I was the perfect protagonist for her tragic courtroom story. The investigator waited for me to finish the last page. My hand shook as I gripped the gold pen tightly. I was helping her win a war I didn't start. I felt dirty. The agents finally cleared the house of all the criminals. The silence that followed was heavy and very thick. Only the hum of the refrigerator broke the morning air. Margaret stood up without any help from her silver cane. She walked toward the back room with a steady gait. I followed her because I had nowhere else to go. My life had been dismantled in less than 12 hours. I was standing in a house that was no longer mine. I had no home. We entered the hidden command center behind the sliding wall. The monitors were still flickering with thermal green images. Margaret pointed to a screen showing a remote mountain cabin. I saw Daniel being led into a secondary facility there. It was not a federal prison but something far worse. It was a private holding cell owned by her firm. The law was just a secondary layer of her revenge. She intended to keep him alive for a very long time. It was horrifying. I realized then that Margaret was the real antagonistic force. She had allowed herself to be poisoned to ensure victory. She had watched her own grandson fail through a camera. The box under the bed was a lure for me. Every step of my journey had been carefully scripted. I looked at the screens and saw my own face. There was a camera in the kitchen I had never noticed. She had recorded my every tear and every single doubt. I was her property. A new car pulled into the driveway with a roar. A man in a tailored suit stepped out with flowers. He looked exactly like the man from my wedding photos. It was Daniel's older brother who had died years ago. Or so I had been told by the Morgan family. He walked into the house with a key of his own. Margaret greeted him with a kiss on both cheeks. My husband was gone, but the cycle was starting again. I was not finished yet. I stood frozen as Julian Morgan crossed the threshold. The brother who allegedly died in a Swiss skiing accident was alive. My objective was simple: I had to get out of this house. The air felt heavy with the scent of lilies and gunpowder. Julian ignored me and walked straight to Margaret for a silent embrace. He looked more like Daniel than Daniel did himself. It was a cruel trick of genetics and long-held family lies. They were all monsters hiding behind expensive suits. Margaret leaned against Julian and gestured toward me, with a ringed hand. She told him I was the one who saved the assets. My value was once again reduced to a line on a ledger. I turned toward the front door, but Gregory blocked the path. He wasn't aggressive, but his stance was a clear and firm warning. I was not allowed to leave this theater of horrors yet. The pressure in my chest made it hard to breathe. They wanted something else. Julian turned his gaze to me and offered a thin, cold smile. He thanked me for taking care of his little problem so well. Daniel was the problem, and I was the solution they needed. I realized then that Julian was the one pulling Margaret's strings. The power balance shifted back into the shadows of the Morgan men. They had used Margaret as bait to lure Daniel into the trap. It was a civil war with me in the middle. I felt sick. Margaret reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, iron key. She pressed it into my palm with a sharp, bony squeeze. This was the key to the Foundation's main vault downtown. It was an irreversible decision to hand it to a stranger. I looked at the metal and saw my own reflection. If I took this, I was officially part of the family firm. It was the price of my freedom and my life. Julian watched me with those predator eyes. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the basement level of the house. Someone was screaming Daniel's name, with a voice full of terror. I realized Linda had escaped her guards during the shift change. She was down there trying to burn the secondary paper trail. Smoke began to curl around the edges of the floorboards quickly. The house was becoming a furnace fueled by secrets and old lies. Julian cursed and reached for his radio to call for help. The chaos returned. I used the distraction to bolt toward the kitchen back door. I shoved past a surprised guard and hit the wet grass. The rain had turned to a light, freezing mist now. My boots slipped on the mud as I ran for my car. I could see the orange glow of fire through the windows. The house was a beacon of destruction in the gray morning. I didn't care if it burned to the very ground. I just wanted to be gone forever. I reached my car and fumbled with the cold door handle. My fingers were numb and slippery from the lingering morning dampness. I glanced back at the burning mansion one last time today. Julian was standing on the porch, watching me leave with calm. He didn't send the guards after me into the woods. He just raised his hand in a slow, mocking wave goodbye. He knew the iron key was still in my pocket. I was tethered. I drove until the gas light flickered on the dashboard. I pulled into a small, lonely station on the highway edge. My objective shifted from escape to a cold, calculated survival plan. I looked at the iron key sitting on the passenger seat. It was more than an entry tool for a bank vault. It was a tracking device disguised as a piece of history. A red light was blinking deep inside the metal stem. They were always watching me. I threw the key into a passing trash truck's open bin. I watched it vanish under a pile of stinking wet bags. The link was severed, but the fear remained in my gut. I checked my reflection in the grimy rearview mirror of my car. My face was pale, but my eyes were finally wide open. I was Reese Morgan, and I was no longer their pawn tonight. I had the ledger and the memories of their crimes. I was the danger now. I started the engine and merged back into the fast lane. The sun was finally breaking through the heavy, gray cloud cover. I saw a black SUV following 3 cars behind me. It didn't speed up or slow down as I moved. I realized that Julian didn't need a key to find me. He had already put a price on my head. The game hadn't ended at the burning house. It was only just beginning on this open road. I smiled. The black's SUV mirrored my every lane change, with predatory precision. I pushed the speedometer to 80 as the highway narrowed into a bridge. My hands were slick with cold sweat against the steering wheel. I needed to vanish before Julian's men forced me off the road. The realization of the lie finally crumbled away into the truth. I was never a victim or a pawn in their game. I was the witness who could bury the entire Morgan dynasty forever. I slammed on the brakes and veered into a crowded rest area. The SUV overshot the exit and skidded on the wet asphalt. I ditched my car behind a row of rusted semi-trucks. My feet hit the gravel as I ran toward the public bus terminal. This was my one chance to break the cycle of their control. I clutched the digital drive containing the ledger proof to my chest. A bus was idling at the curb with open doors. The air inside the terminal smelled of burnt coffee and wet wool. I bought a ticket with the last of my untraceable cash. The driver didn't look up as I boarded the bus. I slumped into a seat near the back window to watch. The black SUV was already circling the parking lot like a shark. Julian was persistent, but he was also predictable in his arrogance. He thought I would run back to a place I knew. The bus lurched forward and merged back onto the main highway. I watched the rest area shrink into the distance through the glass. The black SUV did not follow us onto the open road. I felt the first spark of real hope in my chest. My value wasn't in their money or their ancient, iron keys. It was in the truth I carried inside this small plastic drive. I was finally moving toward a life that I owned. 3 hours later, the bus stopped in a city I had never visited. I stepped off into the cool afternoon air and walked fast. I found a public library and sat at a corner computer. I uploaded the ledger files to an international whistleblowing site. The data packet contained every bribe and every murder plot they had. My finger hovered over the final enter key for a second. I pressed it and watched the progress bar hit completion. The news alerts started hitting the local television screens 10 minutes later. The Morgan Foundation was being raided by federal agents in 3 states. Julian and Margaret were being named as primary suspects in a conspiracy. I walked out of the library and felt the sun on my face. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a final, blocked number. It was a message from Margaret saying she was proud of me. The screen went dark as the water swallowed it. Julian and Margaret could keep their empire of shadows. I was finally stepping into the light.